Hello, everybody. I'm Anthony Kay, and welcome to another Coffee Buzz Weekly. It's Sunday, so it's time for a quick look at what's been happening in the world of coffee. This week, we have an unusual coffee species making a comeback, some extraordinary numbers coming out of China, and a look at the very top end of specialty coffee market, and then we'll finish with our coffee fact, coffee number, and coffee myth of the week. So grab a coffee and let's get started. Our first story is one I find particularly interesting. Over the last weeks, we've spoken about climate change and asked whether Robusta could play a much bigger role in the future of coffee. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question, because there are other coffee species out there. And one attracting renewed attention is called Excelsa. Excelsa has traditionally been a very small part of the global coffee production, particularly compared with Arabica and Robusta. But researchers are increasingly interested in its ability to tolerate hotter and more challenging growing conditions. Excelsa was also recently recognized again as a distinct coffee species, Coffea de Weuvrai. Don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Rather than simply being treated as a variety of Liberica. My take, I find this fascinating. For decades, the coffee industry has essentially concentrated on two species, Arabica and Robusta. But climate change may force us to reconsider some of the coffee plants we've largely ignored. The future of coffee might not simply be Arabica versus Robusta. It might be about creating a much more diverse agricultural toolbox. And diversity generally makes any system more resilient. Our story number 2, keep your eye on China. Our second story comes from China, and the numbers are enormous. Luckin Coffee reported more than 112 million monthly transacting customers in its latest quarter and opened another 2,700 plus stores during the period. Just think about that for a moment. More than 100 million customers interacting with a single coffee chain in 1 month. China historically hasn't had anything close to the per capita coffee consumption of Western Europe or the United States, but that is changing. My take on it? When people ask me where the future growth in coffee could come from, China has to be part of the conversation. You don't need Chinese consumers to suddenly start drinking 5 coffees a day. With a population of that size, even a relatively small increase in coffee consumption per person creates enormous additional demand. And that ultimately affects everybody: growers, traders, roasters, machine manufacturers, and packaging companies. China is definitely one to watch. Story number 3, at the other end of the market, Panama. Now let's go almost completely in the opposite direction. This week, there was also news from the Best of Panama, one of the world's most prestigious specialty coffee competitions. Panama produces a tiny amount of coffee compared with countries such as Brazil and Vietnam. But it has built an extraordinary reputation at the very top end of the specialty market, particularly around geisha coffee. And I think this demonstrates something quite interesting about the coffee industry. At one end, we're talking about hundreds of millions of consumers and enormous industrial volumes. At the other end, we're talking about individual farms, individual lots, and coffees being treated almost like fine wines. And somehow, both markets coexist. My take on it? That's one of the things I love about this coffee industry. There isn't really one coffee market. There are dozens. From an inexpensive cup of filter coffee to an extraordinary geisha from Panama, they're all fundamentally produced from the seed of a coffee cherry. What happens to that seed afterwards creates completely different products and experiences. Story number 4. Coffee knowledge is moving closer to the farm. One smaller story caught my attention this week. The Producer and Roaster Coffee Forum announced plans for its first ever event in Mexico in 2027. Now, another coffee conference doesn't sound particularly exciting, but I think the location matters. For many years, a lot of coffee education, conferences, and industry networking events happens in Europe and North America. We're increasingly seeing that knowledge move closer to the countries actually producing the coffee. My take on it? And I think that's exactly how it should be. Better knowledge at origin means better farming, better processing, and ultimately better coffee. The farmer shouldn't simply be the first link in the supply chain. They should be part of the overall conversation as well. Let's do the coffee fact of the week. Here's something that perhaps you don't know. Coffee cherries on the same tree don't necessarily ripen at the same time. You can have green, perfectly ripe red and overripe cherries all on the same plant. That's one reason why premium coffee is often selectively hand-picked. The picker isn't just simply harvesting coffee. They're actually performing the first quality control inspection in the entire coffee production process, and they're doing it one cherry at a time. Now it's time for the coffee number of the week. This week's number is 2 billion. More than 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed around the world every day. Now, these global estimates vary depending on how consumption is calculated, so don't get too hung up on the exact number. It's the scale that matters. 2 billion cups every day. Behind every one of those cups is farming, processing, transport, roasting, grinding, packaging, and brewing. Coffee might feel like a simple everyday product, and at scale, it is anything but simple. And now for the coffee myth of the week. Should coffee be always stored in the refrigerator? This is false. Coffee is extremely good at absorbing moisture and odors, and repeatedly taking a container in and out of the refrigerator can introduce condensation as well. For coffee you're using regularly, the best solution is simple. Keep it airtight, cool, dry, and away from light. Unless, of course, you particularly enjoy your Ethiopian yugashef with subtle notes of last night's garlic chicken, in which case, carry on. And that's your Coffee Buzz Weekly for this week. Next week, we'll step away from the news a little bit, unless there's something very interesting that comes up, and get back into the engineering and science of coffee, because we're going to look at roasting. What actually happens inside that green coffee bean when we heat it? Why does it turn brown? What is the first crack? What is the Maillard reaction? And how can a few seconds in a roasting profile completely change what eventually ends up in your cup? That's what I'm really looking forward to. So until then, remember, coffee isn't just a drink. It's agriculture, it's chemistry, it's engineering, it's logistics, and it's millions of people around the world working together to produce one perfect cup. Again, I'm Anthony Kay, and this has been Engineered Coffee. Stay curious, and please like, subscribe, and share. It costs you nothing, but will help the channel grow.